MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, please call the Follow Button's electric company and cancel their service. This episode is called Dark Killer. In the summer of 1998, 32-year-old Katherine Gordon sat curled up on the couch with a book inside of her home in Atlanta, Georgia. Across the living room, her husband lifted their newborn baby, Jade, out of the bassinet and carried her toward Katherine to breastfeed. It should have been a sweet moment. Katherine thought about how amazing it was that she actually had a baby. It wasn't that long ago that she was a self-described party girl who thought more about the next bikini contest she could enter than about having a child of her own. But now, the former model, who once moonlighted as a bartender, was a stay-at-home mother with a husband in law school. They were now the model of respectability, and their little baby, Jade, completed their perfect little family. But Katherine didn't think being a mom would hurt so much. Every time Jade latched onto her breast for milk, Katherine felt a burning sensation tear through her chest. It hurt so much she could feel tears welling up in her eyes. Her husband, John, had tried to reassure her that a lot of new moms experienced difficulties with breastfeeding, and Katherine wanted to believe him. Maybe she was still learning how to do it right. Katherine cupped her hand around the soft, warm fuzz of Jade's head and guided her from John's hands to her breast. The baby tilted her face up to stare at her mother as she began to nurse. Katherine started to smile at Jade's big round eyes, but then she noticed her baby's lips. They were bright red, covered in blood. A bolt of fear shot through Katherine, and she pulled Jade off her breast to get a closer look. It didn't look like the blood was coming from Jade's mouth. Instead, it seemed to be coming from Katherine's milk ducts. She was relieved the baby was okay, but what in the world was going on with her? She called for John and jumped up from the couch to hand him their baby. Then she called her doctor and said she needed an appointment right away. The nurse said she could squeeze her in the next day. By the next morning, Katherine was exhausted. She'd barely slept the night before, between waking up for the baby and also worrying about what was happening with her breasts. If it wasn't for the pain in her chest, she might have fallen asleep right there. But her doctor, the same OBGYN who had delivered Jade a month earlier, could not have been kinder. She asked Katherine questions about her pain and carefully examined her breast to pinpoint where the pain was coming from. She also had Katherine produce some milk for analysis in the lab. Then she smiled and explained that Katherine had mastitis, a bacterial infection that targets breast tissue, causing it to swell. The swelling put pressure on Katherine's milk ducts, which led to the pain Katherine felt when she fed Jade. It also led to the bleeding. Mastitis is a very common illness that affects many new mothers, and it's easy to fix with antibiotics. The doctor promised that once Katherine finished taking the medication for 10 days, she'd be back to normal. Katherine exhaled in relief. But something was still bothering her that she needed to share. She told the doctor that 10 years ago, she had gotten breast implants while she was working as a swimwear model in Virginia Beach, Virginia. At the time, Katherine had been excited to get them. They gave her such a full figure that she won beauty contests all over the region. But now, Katherine wondered if the procedure could have caused any problems with breastfeeding her baby. The doctor promised Katherine the infection had nothing to do with the implants. This seemed like a totally ordinary case of mastitis, and she was sure Katherine would feel better after taking the antibiotics. Katherine thanked the doctor and headed home to tell John, hopeful that she would soon feel better. Three days after Katherine finished her course of antibiotics for her mastitis, she and John sat down to a big meal that she'd prepared. Katherine was feeling great and had put Jade down to sleep with no problems earlier in the evening. The antibiotics had taken away all the pain from breastfeeding, and she'd even felt good enough to go to the gym earlier in the week. It was rare these days that Katherine and John got to spend time alone, and now John was very eager to tell his wife about his busy day. Besides attending law school, John also managed a chain of restaurants and bars, so he was juggling a lot. He had always been a type A personality, never satisfied unless he had a new challenge. Catherine had worked hard too, both as a model and then also a sales rep, but now she was content to look after their home and be with the baby. She sometimes thought that there was something a little invisible about being a stay-at-home mom, but she still cherished this time with Jade, even if she did sometimes feel like she was just her husband's cheerleader. A few minutes into dinner, Catherine began to feel extremely tired. She glanced at the clock on the wall. It was only 8 o'clock, and normally she was still full of energy at this time. She tried her best to ignore the fatigue and concentrated as best as she could on what John was saying about his constitutional law class. She told herself that, long days with Jade were exhausting, and probably she just needed more sleep. But when Catherine and John finished eating their meals and they stood up to clear the table, Catherine felt so lightheaded that she immediately sat back down before she fell. As she sat there collecting herself, Catherine realized that her muscles were beginning to ache too, and so she hoped she wasn't now coming down with the flu right when she was finally cured of mastitis. John rushed over to her and asked her what was wrong. Catherine didn't want to alarm him, so she smiled and said she was just tired. He squeezed her hand and told her he would clean up. She should just go to bed and get some rest. Catherine nodded and slowly got up and walked to the bedroom, hoping she'd feel back to normal in the morning. A month later, Catherine limped back into the waiting room of her OBGYN's office. She had tried for weeks to get better on her own, hoping that her healthy eating habits and drinking lots of fresh juice would speed up her recovery, but no matter what she did, it didn't help. She just kept getting worse. These days, her fatigue and aching muscles were making it so hard to get out of bed in the morning, and recently her joints had started to feel hot and tender. Catherine now relied on a group of friends to help her care for the baby all day and make meals, while John started handling more of the house cleaning and Jade's nightly feedings. Catherine felt so guilty. She knew that her mysterious symptoms were making John's life way harder and kind of testing his patience. John was trying to be a good husband and help out around the house, but Catherine found it impossible to keep from criticizing him when he left a dirty dish in the sink or a paper out of place. Catherine couldn't help that she was a perfectionist, and she knew it totally grated on him when she asked so much of him while saying that she was just too tired and achy to keep the house organized herself. Catherine knew something was wrong, and it probably was not mastitis. She was hoping the doctor could help her figure out what was really wrong so she could start feeling like herself again. As Catherine sat on the examining table in her hospital gown, the doctor flipped through the pages of her medical chart and told her what she saw. Catherine's vital signs were normal. Her blood work was normal. She didn't have a major disease like cancer or heart disease, and she didn't have a minor one like mastitis either. In fact, as far as the doctor could see, there was nothing physically wrong with Catherine at all. Then she asked Catherine how she was feeling mentally and if everything was all right at home. Catherine admitted that things were a bit tense these days between her and John, and she explained that her fatigue was making it really hard to take care of her baby. The doctor's expression grew serious, and she sat down next to Catherine. She suspected that her fatigue was due to postpartum depression, a condition that often afflicts new mothers and can be treated with counseling or antidepressants. Catherine was stunned. She did not feel depressed. If she was struggling emotionally, it was only because of her physical discomfort, not the other way around. She told the doctor that when she looked down at Jade and saw her baby smile, she knew that Jade was the best thing in her life. She just needed to get back in good physical shape so she could be the mother she always wanted to be. But the doctor made it clear that Catherine had it wrong. She was confident that the best way for Catherine to get better was to be treated not by her, not by the doctor's office, but by a therapist. Catherine always considered herself the kind of person who speaks up for herself. If someone didn't take her seriously, it made her angry, and she often said so. But this time, as a tired new mom in a hospital gown that didn't quite cover her back, Catherine just fell silent. She thanked the doctor for her concern and then just got up and left. The next day, Catherine was at home playing with Jade on a mat next to the couch She was dressed in her workout clothes and waiting for a babysitter to arrive. Even though she still felt achy and exhausted basically all of the time, she was determined to get back to the gym. She'd felt good working out while she recovered from mastitis, so she hoped that some gentle exercise would help her get her body back under control. A few minutes later, the doorbell rang. Catherine let in the babysitter and kissed Jade goodbye, then she slowly headed out to her car to drive to the gym. Once she got there, the familiar sounds of clattering gym equipment and people working out boosted Catherine's spirits. She felt a surge of energy just watching everyone else lift weights and pedal stationary bikes. Catherine took some deep breaths and carefully stepped onto a treadmill. She set the machine to a moderate walking pace and started out slowly, savoring the feeling of movement after weeks of basically being inactive. She told herself it was mind over matter, but after a few minutes, she felt a tingling sensation in her legs and a shooting pain running down her left arm. Catherine kept walking and tried to ignore the pain, but it was no use. Her body was screaming at her to stop. So eventually she pushed the stop button on the treadmill and headed to a bench. She sat down and began massaging her muscles, but that didn't help. Catherine shook her head in frustration. She had barely begun to work out, and now she was already in so much pain that she needed to grab her gym bag and head home. But when she stood up to leave, she felt yet another strange sensation, an intense itching, and it was coming from inside of her chest. Because Catherine could not literally itch the inside of her chest, she reflexively just began tapping on the middle of her chest with her hand, but the itching feeling didn't go away. And so Catherine tapped harder, and then finally she made a fist and just started banging on her chest. But she still felt this unbearable tingling sensation rising up under her skin. Other people now were staring at her as she pounded away madly at her chest. Finally, she dropped her fist in embarrassment when she realized everybody was staring at her, and then as quick as she could, she grabbed her things and headed out of the gym back to her car. Catherine felt helpless. Her whole body seemed to just be falling apart. She knew she needed more help. Maybe a different doctor would have a better diagnosis than her OBGYN, who seemed convinced that it was all in Catherine's head. As soon as Catherine got back home, she made an appointment with her primary care doctor. A few days later, Catherine sat on yet another examination table, this one in her primary care doctor's office. She described her original fatigue and muscle aches and bleeding nipples, but she made it clear her condition was really getting worse and worse. Now she was suffering from weakness and tingling in her limbs, and this weird constant itching inside of her chest. And Catherine was happy to see that her doctor was taking detailed notes as she spoke, and he had a focused, interested expression on his face. When she was finally done speaking, her doctor tapped his pen on his clipboard for a moment, and then he gave her a serious look. He told her he thought she had something called fibromyalgia, which is a disorder that causes pain and tenderness throughout the body and often results in fatigue. Scientists don't fully understand what causes it, he admitted, and there are no real tests for it either. Doctors tend to diagnose patients with the condition when they can't find another explanation for widespread chronic body aches. And although Catherine's doctor didn't actually say this to her, it is the case that doctors will sometimes default to this vague diagnosis, fibromyalgia, when they basically think it could actually all be in the patient's head, just like Catherine's OBGYN had suggested. Catherine's primary care doctor told Catherine that there's no cure for fibromyalgia. He said the best he could do was prescribe her a painkiller called OxyContin to help manage the symptoms. And so Catherine was relieved to finally hear that something was physically wrong with her, even though it was frightening to hear that there was no cure. But still, it didn't seem like all of her symptoms could be explained away by this fibromyalgia. And so Catherine asked if there were any more tests he could run, or anything he could do at all to try to figure out any of the underlying reasons behind her pain. But the doctor shook his head and said no, and then stood up to end the appointment. He said the OxyContin would help her feel better, and that was the best he could do. And so as Catherine left his office, she started to feel like, once again, a doctor was casually writing off her symptoms rather than seriously looking into the root cause. She didn't know if she believed the fibromyalgia diagnosis any more than the postpartum depression diagnosis, and she wasn't sure she wanted to start taking OxyContin, which can be very addictive. Because even if it did help mask her symptoms, she knew it wouldn't actually help cure the underlying reason behind them. She wanted a cure, not just a temporary fix. Still, Catherine was enough of a dutiful patient that she did go to the pharmacy and she picked up the 4 pill bottles that were waiting for her, just in case. 2 months later, Catherine laid on the couch, completely exhausted. She had decided to follow her intuition and not take the OxyContin, but now her symptoms were getting so much worse. The aches were deeper in her muscles, the joint pain felt hotter and sharper, the numbness, tingling, and itching inside of her chest were nearly constant. On top of that, she was getting more tired than ever. She had just put Jade to bed, and now she didn't even have the energy to make dinner. So John was heating up some leftover pizza for them to eat. Catherine eventually heard the beep of the microwave, and so she dragged herself out to the kitchen. She winced in pain as she sat at the table while John silently served them their food. Catherine could tell he was mad, but she didn't really know what to say, so she just sat there quietly while they ate, and then she got up to do the dishes. But Catherine was in so much pain that she had to grip the side of the counter for support. John watched her silently and just shook his head. Then he told her that she had been complaining of aches and weakness for months, but she refused to do anything about it. 2 doctors had given her a diagnosis, but she had just rejected both and refused to follow their advice. He was exhausted too, and at his wit's end, trying to understand what was going on with his wife. In fact, he wasn't even sure there was anything actually wrong with her. Before she could say anything, John turned and walked out of the room. Catherine stood at the counter for another minute and then stumbled to a kitchen chair and just sat there crying for what felt like hours. Finally, she stopped crying and dried her face off with a napkin and told herself that she couldn't give up yet. Maybe there was still an answer for her out there, and even if she didn't have her husband's support, she'd continue to look for answers alone. She had to keep trying for Jade. A few months later, in the spring of 1999, Catherine finally got an appointment with a rheumatologist who was an expert both on fibromyalgia and arthritis. Since that fight with John in the kitchen, Catherine had gone out and seen various other doctors, but none of them had been able to help. But now, as she waited in this latest exam room, she felt hopeful that this specialist could solve her case once and for all. After a short wait, the doctor came in. He was an older man, and although he seemed like he knew what he was doing, she didn't like the way he called Catherine honey. She decided she would forgive his sexism if he could offer her something besides addictive painkillers as a solution. And he did. The doctor began scolding Catherine for not listening to what doctors had already told her. The problem is in your head. He had reviewed her charts, and as far as he was concerned, she didn't have a disease. And until she could accept that and get herself together, her personal life would continue to suffer. Partway through the doctor's lecture, Catherine just stopped listening, like when she was getting scolded as a kid. She felt humiliated and desperate and mad. She knew there was something physically wrong with her, but she was now starting to feel her will to fight slipping away. And she knew the doctor was right about one thing. Her marriage was crumbling under the weight of her sickness. Catherine pushed herself up from her chair and silently left the office. She walked slowly to her car, having to stop periodically to lean against the wall to rest. When Catherine got home, she paid the babysitter and put Jade in the playpen in the living room. Then she lay down on the couch and watched as her little daughter crawled around the space. Jade was nearly 1 year old, and Catherine loved to see her blossoming into a little toddler. But watching from the couch also made Catherine feel guilty and totally inadequate. She wanted to play with her little girl and crawl around on the floor with her, but she just couldn't. Catherine told Jade how beautiful and special she was, but to her surprise, the words that came out of her mouth sounded funny, almost like she was drunk. She sat up straight and tried to speak normally, but again, the words that tumbled out were ragged and slow. And so Catherine thought to herself, oh my God, I can't even talk anymore. Catherine started to feel a rising sense of panic. If her symptoms got much worse, she wouldn't be able to care for her baby at all. As the sun faded, Catherine managed to feed Jade and get her to sleep. She promised herself that she would clean up the baby's mess in the living room, but first she just needed to lay back down on the couch. An hour later, the front door opened and her husband John walked in. Catherine was still laying on the couch tucked underneath a blanket, and she could immediately feel her husband's disapproval as he stared at her and then also at the messy room all around her. John dropped his bag and sat down next to Catherine. He told her enough was enough. It was time to suck it up and get herself together. Catherine felt tears roll down her face, but she didn't have the energy to respond. They'd had this conversation over and over again, and it always arrived at the same place, with John not believing her. And she just did not have the energy to fight anymore. So she just laid there, letting tears stream down her face. John didn't say anything more either. After a minute, he just got up and left. As Catherine lay there alone, she felt something shift inside of her. She'd been fighting with her doctors, her husband, and her body for months. She realized that she'd gotten to the end of her rope. After 10 months of fighting, she felt hopeless, alone, and totally out of options. Catherine could not keep living like this. That night, Catherine dragged herself into the bathroom and opened the medicine cabinet to get her toothbrush. Her 4 unopened bottles of OxyContin were standing on the glass shelf. She realized the pills would be more than enough to end her life. Catherine closed the cabinet, hobbled over to the bed, and crawled under the covers. As she tossed and turned, she kept thinking about those bottles of OxyContin. She looked over at John, who was sound asleep. She didn't want to leave him and Jade alone, but she just couldn't bear the pain anymore. She was done. Tonight, she would sleep beside her husband for the last time. The next day, she'd make sure Jade was with someone, and while John was at law school, she would overdose on her pills. Catherine closed her eyes, satisfied that she finally had a plan. Then she fell into a deep sleep. But as she slept, Catherine had a strange dream. A jumble of images flickered through her mind, like some broken film reel. She couldn't make sense of what they meant, and then she heard a voice. It was deep and powerful and cut through all the chaos of her dream. The voice told her that there was something poisonous growing inside of her that needed to come out. Catherine bolted upright, her heart pounding in her chest. The dream felt so real that suddenly she felt like she could taste poison in her mouth. Catherine suddenly knew that she had just gotten a message that could save her life. The next day, Catherine sat in the waiting room of yet another doctor's office. This time, she was meeting with a surgeon named Susan Kolb. The voice in Catherine's dream had told her that whatever this poison was in her body, it needed to come out, like be surgically removed. And Catherine was almost positive she knew what it was. Now she just needed to convince a surgeon to actually perform the surgery. Catherine described her symptoms to the surgeon for what felt like the millionth time. When she mentioned the shooting pain in her arm, Dr. Kolb stopped her. She said she'd seen those symptoms before, and they weren't caused by postpartum depression or fibromyalgia. Dr. Kolb was pretty sure she knew what was making Catherine sick. It was exactly what the voice in Catherine's dream had said it was. But there was no way to know for sure without actually doing surgery. She needed to visually confirm her diagnosis, and no amount of imaging from MRI or CT scans would be enough. She would have to cut Catherine open in the hope that she was right, exposing her to all the risks of surgery from bleeding to infection to organ damage. Catherine felt a surge of fear and also hope. The prospect of undergoing serious surgery was terrifying, but far less so than the prospect of continuing to get weaker and sicker. So she took a deep breath and told Dr. Kolb to please schedule her for the soonest available time slot. Three days later, Catherine lay on an operating table at a local hospital. Dr. Kolb stood at her side and asked if she had any last questions or doubts before they began the procedure. Catherine confirmed that she didn't, and Dr. Kolb nodded to the anesthesiologist. They stepped forward and put some drugs into Catherine's IV. Dr. Kolb waited until Catherine was in a deep sleep before reaching for her scalpel. Then she made a quick incision in Catherine's skin, revealing the fatty tissue beneath. With precise and careful strokes, she continued to cut deeper and deeper. She kept going until her knife was underneath Catherine's pectoralis major muscle, the largest muscle in the chest. There, Dr. Kolb saw what she was looking for: the round implants from Catherine's breast augmentation surgery 11 years earlier. The implants were in the right position, and they didn't appear to have any holes, which was a common problem with implants. But these were not the issues Dr. Kolb was looking for. She reached down and loosened one of the implants and then pulled it out, and immediately Dr. Kolb was shocked at what she saw. The problem was so obvious, the doctor knew right away she would not need to run any additional tests to confirm her diagnosis. The implant was supposed to be full of clear saline liquid that normally keeps it round and firm, but instead, the liquid inside of Catherine's implant was pitch black and full of tiny floating particles. Dr. Kolb quickly switched to the other side of Catherine's chest and removed the second implant, and it too was also black and full of particles. Dr. Kolb told her astonished surgical team that she had found what was making Catherine sick, and the cause was as shocking as it was unlikely. It would turn out Catherine's breast implants were full of a black mold, the same kind of fungus that grows in people's bathrooms. The contamination probably began about 10 months earlier, right after Catherine's breasts began bleeding as she was feeding Jade. She really did have mastitis then, but the antibiotics that her doctor had given her to treat it had caused a brand new problem. The drugs had cleared up the mastitis, but they did their job almost too well. They also killed healthy bacteria inside of Catherine's body that helped protect against other infections. And so as a result, Catherine soon developed this fungal infection that sneaked into her breast implants through a loose valve or seal. From there, the fungus started breeding inside of the liquid saline of the implants and began releasing a steady stream of poisonous toxins back into Catherine's body that were making her very sick. If Catherine had ignored the warning signs from her body and her powerful dream, the implants could have easily eventually burst and killed her. But she listened to the voice in that dream, and it saved her life. Dr. Kolb put Catherine on a 2-month course of a common antifungal medication called fluconazole. After it was completed, Catherine felt much better. It was a long road to recovery, but eventually, Catherine would feel totally normal. She and John were able to work through the relationship issues that manifested during her illness, and they would actually go on to write a book together about relationships. 2 months after her implants were removed, Catherine became pregnant with her son, Cole. She continues to live a healthy life with no long-term effects from her fungal infection. The FDA now requires that breast implant manufacturers include prominent boxed warnings and updated recommendations designed to detect leaks in the implants. Located in the far northwestern section of Canada is the aptly named Northwest Territories. It is a massive swath of land that virtually nobody lives inside of. To make that point crystal clear, consider the following. The country of Germany has a population of 83 million people, give or take. The Northwest Territories is 4 times as large as Germany, but only has a population of about 50,000 people. In addition to being this huge and mostly unoccupied space, the Northwest Territories are almost completely wild. Think dense forests, huge mountains, massive rivers and lakes, and lots of really big animals. Even for highly experienced outdoors men and women, the Northwest Territories can be a truly hazardous place. And within this truly hazardous place, there is one part that is the most hazardous, and it's right in the middle of the Northwest Territories. And it's this 11,000 square mile stretch of just pure wilderness that's called the Nahanni Valley. In 1976, the Nahanni Valley was made into a national park. But don't let that fool you. This is not some family park that anybody can go to. There are no tourist accommodations, so there's no hotels, there's really nothing inside of it. And there are no roads that lead into this park. The only way you can get inside this valley is by plane or by boat or by very stressful and difficult overland hike. But for those who are able and willing to make the effort to get inside of this valley, you have the opportunity to explore one of the most beautiful places on the planet, because this section of the world is almost completely untouched by man. It is really nature at its purest form. However, there is a catch. This valley is said to be haunted. Over the last 10,000 years, the handful of native tribes that have attempted to settle inside of the Nahanni Valley have all either suddenly disappeared without a trace, like the Naha tribe that literally overnight just was gone, leaving behind their shelters, their food, their supplies, just gone. No one knows what happened to them. Or the tribes have abruptly fled, claiming they were being terrorized or stalked by creatures lurking in the forest, like these white demons and these large wolves they called wahilas. Now, of course, this just sounds like folklore, and it might very well be that that's all it is, folklore. But starting in the early 1900s, some very strange things started happening in the Nahanni Valley that were not folklore. These things happened, and they were horrifying. These were horrifying, real events. And they might, depending on your viewpoint, give credit to some of the theories that the native tribes people have about this valley, which is there's something evil lurking out in this forest, but we just don't know what it is. In 1904, three brothers, Willie, Frank, and Charlie McLeod, who all lived in the Northwest Territories, decided they wanted to go looking for gold in the Nahanni Valley. They figured because so few people had ever been inside of this valley that if there was gold to be found, then certainly it had not been found yet. And so after a very long and arduous journey using sled dogs and trains and homemade boats, they finally slipped into the valley and found themselves on what's called the Flat River, which runs right through the center of the Nahanni Valley. Now, the Flat River is kind of ironically named because it's anything but flat. It's actually more like a rapid at certain points. But either way, the three brothers, they're on their boat, they're making their way up the Flat River, and at some point they pull off onto the riverbank and they set up camp. And then once their camp is set up, they go down to the river and they put their gold sluices in the water. A gold sluice is this long, skinny box that's usually made of wood, and it has a strainer on one side. And gold miners will put it in the water submerged, and they will kind of shovel the sediment on the bottom of the water into this little funnel, and the big stuff will get stopped by the strainer, and the dirt and the water will just kind of flow out the side. And so the idea is you can trap gold nuggets inside of this sluice. And so the three brothers, they get their sluices up and they start looking for gold, and right away they hit pay dirt. There is tons of gold in this river. And so all day, all night, they get all this gold. The next morning they do the same thing, and by the time all their containers are literally filled to the brim with gold, they decide, hey, let's go back and turn this in, get some money for it, and then come back out here. And so they pack up their tent, they pack up all their supplies, and they put everything back in their boat. They get out onto Flat River, and at some point very early on in their journey back, the boat capsizes, and the boat actually breaks apart from the strength of the rapids of Flat River. And so the boat actually just sinks, and much of their supplies sink, including all of their gold. But the three brothers are able to grab some of their supplies, like their rifle and some lumber and some of their mining supplies, and they swim it all to shore. They catch their breath. They're totally devastated at the loss of the gold, but they're alive. They have enough supplies to survive. And so they figure all they can do is maybe try to go back to their original site, try to get some more gold because they did still have a sluice, and then try to get out of there and then, regroup and come back another time. And so using some of the lumber they recovered from their broken boat, and then also by cutting down some trees, they literally fashioned another boat and then hopped back on the Flat River, and they went back up to that site where they had found gold earlier. They set up their sluice, they set up their camp again, and this time they didn't find any gold. So all day, this very disappointing day that they've already lost all their gold, now they're not finding any more gold. And so that night when they went to bed, they decided that the next day they were just going to leave. And so the next day they get up, they pack up, they hop back on the Flat River on this new boat they built, and they're able to make their way out of the valley and get back to their homes. As soon as they get back home, the two younger brothers, Willie and Frank, start talking about how they want to go back into Nahanni Valley and go get more gold, because now they know there's gold out there. It's not a question, yeah, we didn't find it that second time, but we know it's out there. Charlie, the older brother, he wanted to get the gold, but he felt like, hey, that was a close call with the boat flipping over. I don't know if it's a good idea, so I'm actually not going to go. You guys can go, I'm going to stay. And so several months goes by, and Frank and Willie have been doing all this preparation for this additional trip into the valley. And finally, in 1905, they're ready. And so Willie, Frank, and a third man called Robert Weir, who was a friend of theirs, he was going to replace Charlie. The three of them, they make their way up into the valley. Now, they didn't tell anyone how long they were going to be gone for, and so when they didn't send any word and no one had heard from them in weeks, Charlie was actually not that concerned because he knew there was lots of gold to be had out in the Nahanni Valley, and so he figured they must have struck it rich, and now they've decided to live out there long term, or at least maybe through the summer, or maybe the next year, and so he wasn't concerned, and because he wasn't concerned, nobody else was concerned about these three men. And so weeks turned into months, turned into a year, and still no one's heard from these three men. No one's heard from Willie, Frank, or from Robert, but still Charlie maintains that nothing can be wrong because there's three of them out there. They're incredibly experienced. There is a ton of gold out there. I'm sure they're just killing it and they're just acquiring all this gold, and we're going to see them in the next couple of months maybe, and everything's going to be just fine. But a whole other year would go by. So they've been out there for 2 years and no one has heard from them. And at this point, Charlie thinks to himself, okay, I have to go out and see if they're okay. And so he rounds up 4 other people from his town and he mounts an expedition to head back into the Nahanni Valley to go find his 2 brothers and find Robert Weir. Charlie and his search party eventually, after yet another long and arduous journey, they get into Nahanni Valley and they get onto the Flat River. And so they start making their way upstream along Flat River. So it must have been a very treacherous journey getting through the rapids of this river. And the whole time they're scanning the left and the right side, hoping to see some sign of life. They're looking for any indication that these 3 men are out here and just fine, but they didn't see any sign of them. And so they finally made their way all the way up to the very end of Flat River, or I should say the very beginning of Flat River, where it breaks off from a much larger river called the South Nahanni River. And once they turned onto the South Nahanni River, they began going downstream. And again, they're looking on either side for any sign of these 3 men. There's no sign of them. And then the river they're on takes a very sharp turn. It's actually called the Big Bend, and it's about a 45-degree turn. And as soon as you make that turn, it dumps you into this 10-mile stretch of river called Second Canyon. Now, along South Nahanni River, which is about 350 miles long, there are these 4 canyons that the water passes through. And they're labeled 4th Canyon, 3rd Canyon, 2nd Canyon, and 1st Canyon. And these canyons are massive. These sheer cliffs on either side of the river shoot up to 3,000 feet above the water, and in some parts, the water is actually just as deep, thousands of feet deep. And Second Canyon is unique because the cliff faces are as sheer as you're going to get, and the cliff faces almost butt up exactly up against the water. So there's really very little shoreline on either side. So once you're in this 10-mile stretch, you're basically boxed in. You have thousands of feet of water below you. You have these massive cliffs on either side, and there's really nowhere to go. You need to get through this section of the river before you can effectively get onto the shoreline and take a break from being in your boat. And along these cliffs are these openings you see high up all over the cliffs on both sides that are openings to these massive cave systems inside of these thousands of feet tall cliffs. And because of how difficult it is to not only get to Nahanni Valley, but also to get up to these different cave openings, nobody's gone inside of them. We don't know what's inside of these caves, save for the few that are down low enough that people can explore. So as you're passing through Second Canyon, it's almost like you're being watched because there's all these openings, but you can't see into them, and you're just forced to go down this 10-mile stretch, and you can't really go anywhere, and whatever's watching you, it's watching you. As soon as Charlie and his search party entered into Second Canyon, it would have immediately gotten darker, because that's another part of being in Second Canyon. These huge cliff walls of this canyon obscure the sunlight, and so they would have entered into this canyon, it would have gotten darker, and it's very windy inside of Second Canyon. So the winds would have picked up, so it's dark, very strange setting for them to be in, and they would have been looking on either side at these little strips of shoreline on either side, barely big enough for a boat to be. They would have been looking for any sign of life, but they didn't see anything. As they're making their way down this 10-mile stretch, as they're getting closer and closer to actually entering into First Canyon, which is the next canyon you would enter into, the sides of the river start to get slightly larger where you could actually beach a boat. There's some trees, and on the left-hand side, right before exiting Second Canyon, they notice there is actually a tent perched within some trees. And so the search party naturally goes right over to the shoreline, they hop out, but as soon as they step foot on land and they have a clearer view of this tent and what's outside of it, they notice there is a body clearly lying on the ground outside of the tent. And so Charlie and the search party, they run over, and as soon as they're up close, they can tell this body is missing its head. And they see the clothes on this body are totally charred and burned, and whoever this was, they were reaching with their right arm when they died. And right outside of the reach of their right arm was a rifle that was propped up against a tree. And so they walk around this one body, and they go around towards the backside of the tent where the opening to this tent is, and they find another body, another very badly decomposed body, and it's positioned kind of halfway in the tent and halfway out of the tent. And there's a blanket kind of partially obscuring this person's body, and when they move the blanket, they see this body too is missing its head. So Charlie and the search party, they continue to search around the camp in hopes of finding the heads of these two people to try to figure out who they are, but they never find the heads. However, they do find some personal effects both in the pockets of these two bodies and then also inside the tent that would confirm these are Charlie's brothers. As for the third man that had been with them, Robert Weir, he was not at the campsite, and in fact he would never actually be found officially. However, a little ways down the river, another partial skeleton would be found several months later that was attributed to Robert. However, that was not 100% confirmed to be Robert. The only other interesting thing that was found at this campsite was a carving in a nearby tree, and it just said, "We have found a fine prospect," indicating that Charlie's brothers had found gold. But there was no gold either on them or in their camp or in the river nearby. Nothing. There was no gold. Charlie and his search party would leave the valley and get in touch with the mounted police, who would come out to the site where the brothers had been found. They would launch an investigation, and ultimately they would come to the conclusion that all three of these men, the two brothers and Robert, had starved to death, and then after they had perished, animals had taken them off, which is why Robert was found so far away and why the skulls were missing from the two brothers. Now, Charlie did not believe that. He believed they had been attacked by native tribes in the area, but the police were not buying that. They said this was a natural thing, this was an accident, and so that's that. When the story of these two decapitated men made the news, people went crazy about this. People were very divided about what they thought really happened. There was a percentage of people that believed that partial skeleton that was found, that was not Robert Weir. He had not died. He had murdered the two brothers, decapitated them, and then made off with their gold. The other percentage of people believed that all three men, the two brothers and Robert, had been attacked by a person, a group of people, an animal, a creature, something. There was some sort of attack, and that's why the two brothers were in those positions that indicated they had encountered something horrifying, with one brother reaching for the gun and the other appearing to have leapt from his bed before he ultimately died. But regardless of which side you fell on, pretty much everybody at the time who heard about the story became terrified of the Nahanni Valley. Specifically, they became terrified of that stretch in Second Canyon where the two brothers had been found. And so actually that stretch got renamed the Headless Valley, and from that point forward, that's all it was known as. And so even though there were obvious gold prospects in the Headless Valley and all along the South Nahanni River and the Flat River, people, after this story broke, were just not prepared to risk going in there and potentially becoming another victim. And so people kind of stayed away from Nahanni Valley. 8 years later, though, in 1913, a gold prospector named Martin Jorgensen decided, you know what, I'm not going to let some scary stories about some headless men and, ghosts and killers on the loose, I'm not going to let any of that get in the way of me taking gold out of Nahanni Valley. So, all on his own, Martin makes the arduous trek inside of Nahanni Valley. He makes his way up up Flat River, and he finally finds a spot about 70 miles upstream of where Headless Valley was. And he actually built a one-room cabin because he was going to stay there through the winter. And then the plan was he would meet up with his partners the following summer. And so right after he got there, he set up his sluices and he started mining for gold. And apparently he found a lot of it because he sent word back to his partners outside of the valley that he had made it rich. And so his partners were really excited to meet up with him the following summer and see how much he got because they planned on going back into the valley with him that summer. So that summer rolls around, his partners go to the meeting spot right outside the valley, but Martin doesn't show up. And so his partners, they stay outside at this meeting space for several days until finally, when he doesn't show up, they decide, we have to go in there and see if he is okay, because at this point he should have been here. There's no excuse. And so they end up going into the Nahanni Valley. They make their way up Flat River and they go roughly to the area where they knew he was staying based on the message he had sent earlier. He had described where he was staying, and they actually found his cabin. Or I should say they found what was left of his cabin. His cabin had been completely torched, burned to the ground, and laying on the ground next to the burned out cabin was the burned out remains of another headless corpse. And this corpse belonged to Martin Jorgensen. The police did a thorough investigation, but they were never able to determine what actually killed him. The police did not connect Martin's death with the two McLeod brothers' deaths, even though they were all decapitated. They were in roughly the same area, and it happened within a few years of each other, and they looked very, very similar. Even though that all was true, the police said, nope, these are totally separate. Martin died for some reason, and then animals took parts of him away, and that's why his skull is missing. Martin's skull was never located, and the gold that Martin claimed to have struck it rich with was also not at the cabin, not on him. There was no gold anywhere in the vicinity. When Martin's death made the news, people went crazy, and despite the police assuring everyone that his death was not connected to the McLeod brothers' deaths, even though the police were saying that, the public didn't see it that way. It was just too easy to connect one decapitation with two other decapitations that have happened close together in a relatively short time frame, and so a lot of people assumed there must be a killer on the loose somewhere in Nahanni Valley. 7 years later, in 1921, the rumors of a killer on the loose were still alive and well when gold prospector John O'Brien and his partner decided, you know what, despite the rumors of this so-called killer or whatever's going on in the Nahanni Valley, let's go into the Nahanni Valley and try our hand. Let's try to get some gold. And so the two of them made their way into the valley and they set up camp in Headless Valley, not far from where the McLeod brothers had been found decapitated. So they set up their camp and they're there for a couple of days. They're doing well. They're finding gold. And then at some point, John tells his partner that he's going to go out and check all of their traps along the river. And he'll be back in about 8 or 9 days. And so his partner waits 8 or 9 days and John doesn't come back. And a couple of days after that goes by and now John's past due. And so the partner decides he has to go out looking for him. And so there was another gold prospector in the area. And so this partner contacted him and the two of them went to the river and began walking upstream until they found John. And he had frozen to death, but it was very interesting the way he was positioned. He was sitting in front of this obviously previously lit campfire. He wasn't hunched over. He didn't look like he was in pain. He looked like he was just enjoying the fire. There was nothing on his face that indicated discomfort or pain or fear. He was even holding the matchbook in his hand. It was like he was just sitting there enjoying the fire when something caused him to suddenly freeze. In fact, witnesses would say John looked like he had been flash frozen, as if it had happened in a matter of seconds, because it didn't look like he had reacted properly to freezing to death. And the police, when they came out, they would say, this is odd. This is odd the way he's positioned. But ultimately, he died because he froze to death. And so there's no foul play here. And so no further investigation is needed. 5 years later, in 1926, a hunting party that included a young woman named Annie Lafferty was camping out along the Flat River inside of Headless Valley. And so that night, they're all kind of joking around the fire. And then at some point, they decide to all go to sleep. And then the next day, when everybody gets up, Annie is no longer in camp and there's no sign of where she went. And so they begin by yelling out and walking around the immediate vicinity to see maybe if she stepped away for a minute, but Annie's just gone and no one knows where she went. And so the hunting party spends the rest of the day looking for Annie, but there's no sign of her. They ultimately leave the valley. They tell police. Police come out. There's this huge search, but Annie's never found. Several months later, a man named Charlie, who happened to have been out near Flat River, near this hunting party when they were out there, but Charlie himself was not in the hunting party. He didn't know Annie. He was just in the vicinity. He overheard someone talking about a member of that hunting party, specifically a woman, going missing. And when he heard that, he knew he had to tell police what he had seen that night out near Flat River. So he goes to police and he explains that that night when he knew there was this hunting party over there, he could hear them, he knew they were over there. He said at some point he went to bed and then he woke up when he heard the sound of rocks falling into the river in front of him. He was sleeping along the river's edge. So he sits up and he looks out across the river. It's totally dark, but there's some moonlight, and he's kind of looking around wondering what's causing the sound, but he can't see it, and then he hears it again, and he can tell it's off to his left. And these are not huge rocks. These are like medium to small size rocks, like rocks you could just pick up and throw. And so he's looking, and all of a sudden he sees, maybe a couple hundred yards away through some sparse trees, he sees a naked woman, a white naked woman, running on all fours up this mountainside. And as she's running up the mountainside, her feet and her hands are knocking little rocks into the river down below. She's right on the edge of this cliff. And as she's running up this hill, she stops and she turns, and he gets a good look at her face. And Charlie would say he was so taken aback by her face. It looked like she was possessed. There was something wrong with her face. And so Charlie instinctively
this virus, even though Islam is Malaysia's leading religion. This was strange because Japanese encephalitis is transmitted through mosquito bites. And there was no reason why people of a particular religion would be immune to mosquitoes. This made Dr. Chua even more skeptical that the patients they were studying had Japanese encephalitis. So he decided to run his own tests. He was going to isolate the disease right there in his lab so he could get a better look at it. Dr. Chua hand-selected cerebrospinal fluid and serum samples from patients whose symptoms most closely resembled Japanese encephalitis. Then he put each one in a sealed dish and tucked it into an incubator that warmed it to the temperature of a human body, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Then Chua waited. He hoped that the warmed-up fluid samples would create the perfect environment for the disease to show itself. If successful, Dr. Chua would eventually be able to cultivate highly concentrated and highly lethal dishes full of the disease that he could study. Nearly 1 week later, Dr. Chua pulled the cultures from the incubator. While the samples had been incubating, 5 more patients had been admitted to a nearby hospital with the same deadly symptoms. Their fluid samples were sent to Dr. Chua's department. Dr. Chua knew that every second counted. If this disease was not Japanese encephalitis, and Dr. Chua was able to identify what it really was, then doctors might be able to find a cure and save everyone who was already sick. Dr. Chua slid the samples under his microscope and then stooped down to look through the eyepiece. His experiment with the incubator had worked. The dish was jammed full of invading microbes. But when this virus was exposed to animal cells, the nature of its deadly effect was unexpected. Dr. Chua wasn't sure what he was looking at, but it definitely was not Japanese encephalitis. Dr. Chua knew he needed to show his boss, who was the head of the department at the university, right away, and so Dr. Chua sprinted out the door to find him. 20 minutes later, Dr. Chua's boss was examining the same culture under the microscope. Dr. Chua stood nearby, his stomach churning with anxiety. He knew his finding was significant, and they could save lives if they acted fast. But after a long moment, Dr. Chua's boss finally stood and just shook his head. He interpreted the results differently and didn't see enough evidence to prove that the virus was new. He argued that the virus's strange behavior could be due to normal variations in the culture, or even that the culture could be contaminated. He still believed that the results were consistent with this being Japanese encephalitis. He told Dr. Chua to throw the sample away. Dr. Chua was shocked. He knew that his experiment was not contaminated, but he also knew better than to outright challenge his superior. However, Dr. Chua knew he could not back down completely. There was too much at stake. He just needed to find the right moment to convince his boss. 4 days later, on March 9th, Dr. Chua got his chance. He was driving with his boss and 2 other colleagues returning from a meeting. The rain was coming down in sheets, and their car was inching forward in heavy traffic. It gave Dr. Chua a captive audience. Dr. Chua glanced at the men and then leaned forward in his seat, making sure he had his boss's attention. Dr. Chua cleared his throat and then quickly launched into his theory. He emphasized the virus's unique effect on animal cells and said the variation was enough to prove that they were dealing with something unknown. The disease they were fighting was caused by an entirely new virus, he said, and they needed to take action immediately. The sickness had already spread to several other Malaysian states and hopped the border into Singapore. As Dr. Chua described his findings, his colleagues' expressions showed signs of concern, but Dr. Chua's boss remained neutral. He pressed on, explaining that while he was sure they had discovered a new virus, their lab's equipment was not yet powerful enough to identify it. He argued that they really needed to send the cultures to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the United States. The CDC had the right equipment, and it was in their best interest to help. This wasn't simply an outbreak affecting people in Malaysia. It had the potential to become a global pandemic with devastating consequences if they didn't control it quickly. The air in the car was thick with tension as Dr. Chua waited for his boss to react. Finally, his boss cleared his throat and spoke. Dr. Chua's theory had merit, he said, and he would think about it overnight. Then the car they were in pulled up to Dr. Chua's boss's home, and his boss climbed out and walked away in the pouring rain. The next morning, Dr. Chua woke up to the sound of his phone ringing. It was his boss. He told Dr. Chua that he'd made some calls, and a travel visa was being expedited for Dr. Chua to get to the United States. Dr. Chua was so relieved, and he thanked his boss, and then he rushed to the hospital to prepare the virus samples for a trip to America. Four days later, Dr. Chua stood in the CDC's research lab in Fort Collins, Colorado. Dr. Chua peered through a powerful electron microscope at his slides. This awesome device was literally thousands of times better than anything Dr. Chua was using at magnifying samples, giving Chua a much more intimate look at his adversary. Underneath the lens of the microscope, his virus cultures revealed tiny ring-like formations covering the slide. He blinked and looked again to make sure. Now, Dr. Chua knew for certain that the scientists in Malaysia had misidentified the virus. But Dr. Chua did not feel excitement or pride that he had been right. Instead, at that moment, he felt terror. The type of virus on that slide was far deadlier than Japanese encephalitis, and it wasn't spread by mosquitoes. But, based on the virus's unique characteristics, Dr. Chua was almost positive he knew what was spreading it. He needed to report his findings immediately. Dr. Chua flagged down one of the CDC's scientists and asked for the nearest telephone. After he finished his call to his boss in Malaysia, he showed his discovery to CDC officials. They were instantly alarmed and agreed with Dr. Chua's assessment. The outbreak in Malaysia had the potential to kill millions of people. Back in Malaysia, a few days after Dr. Chua's discovery, the 57-year-old cabinet maker, Kiam Bing, watched from the doorway of his workshop as soldiers put up barricades at the end of the main road in his town. Kiam Bing was staying inside as much as possible to avoid the mosquitoes that he believed were carrying this virus. The only time he went outside was to run between his home and his shop. By now, it seemed like almost every family in town had lost a loved one to this terrible disease. They'd all died painful and horrifying deaths, and residents were in a panic. The disease was showing no signs of slowing down either, and so the government was barricading the road into town to keep residents there quarantined. Kiam Bing had lived here his entire life, and he couldn't remember any other time when travel in or out of the area had been restricted. The road was usually bustling with people going to and from work at this time of the day, but now it was deserted. The only sound was the fluttering of these red banners that people hung outside of their houses to ward off death. The silence frightened Kiam Bing. Even his dogs seemed different. Instead of jumping around and playing with their ball, they curled up quietly on the floor. And then, as Kiam Bing was watching all this strangeness unfold in front of him, Qian Bing began to hear the sound of gunshots. When Qian Bing heard these gunshots, he instinctively hid behind his counter. Once it stopped, Qian Bing stood up and slowly opened his front door to see what was going on outside. And what he saw was a group of soldiers with rifles slung across their backs, marching out from behind a farm down the road and heading towards the next one. Also, there were all these military vehicles full of dozens more soldiers that were driving down the road, and they were all heading for different farms. Qian Bing watched as some of the soldiers stopped in front of the farm right across the street, and they went around to the back of the property. Qian Bing stepped out of his store to get a better look, and he peered around the corner of the farm across the street, and he could see the soldiers now pointing their rifles towards the trees, and also the pig pens below the trees. Qian Bing knew what was coming next, and he couldn't bear to watch it. He ran back to the doorway of his shop, and then a few moments later, he heard more gunfire and the terrible sound of pigs squealing in agony. Qian Bing could literally smell the coppery stench of blood as it wafted through the thick hot air. And then moments later, the soldiers emerged from behind the farm and began marching down the street towards the next farm. And the farm's owner from across the street followed the soldiers out onto the road, and the owner just sat down on the sidewalk and put his face in his hands. Once the soldiers had marched down the road and were gone, Qian Bing hustled across the street and knelt down next to the farmer who still had his face in his hands. After making sure this farmer was okay, Qian Bing gently asked, what happened? What's going on? And the farmer just shook his head in disbelief, and in a shaky voice, he told Qian Bing that the government had issued an order for all the pigs in this village to be slaughtered and buried. They told him that this would stop the terrible disease that had been killing people for months. Qian Bing was shocked. He remembered that the government had sprayed the town for the mosquitoes to stop the disease. Now they were saying it came from the pigs? Qian Bing returned to his shop and closed the door. He smiled at his dogs, who hadn't moved since he left. Qian Bing felt badly for his neighbors, but at the same time, he was grateful that the mystery of this disease seemed to be solved, and that now Qian Bing really was safe. It was nearly impossible to avoid all mosquitoes like Qian Bing had been trying to do, but he had no reason to interact with pigs, which apparently were the reason this disease was spreading, and so Qian Bing really felt like he was going to be okay. 2 days later, Qian Bing woke up feeling feverish. His head was pounding and he couldn't pull himself from the bed. His skin felt like it was on fire. In a panic, he realized that he must be sick with this mysterious disease. Qian Bing didn't understand how this was happening to him. He hadn't gone near any pigs. But Qian Bing didn't have time to worry about that. He needed to get to a hospital. He managed to drag himself out of bed and stumbled over to a neighbor's house where he knew there was a phone. He begged the neighbor to please call him an ambulance, and then Qian Bing collapsed to the ground. A few minutes later, the paramedics arrived and took Qian Bing to the nearest major hospital, which was about 50 miles to the north, at the University Hospital in Kuala Lumpur. The intake nurse in the emergency room asked Qian Bing to describe his symptoms and when they started, and Qian Bing, who had been strapped to a gurney for the entire ambulance ride, felt his voice stick in his throat. To his horror, he couldn't respond. He tried to swallow, but it was no use. He was totally paralyzed. Qian Bing could see the nurse's eyes widen in alarm. He watched, terrified, as the nurses wheeled him through the hospital, helpless as he felt his body lock around him. It didn't take long to confirm that Qian Bing's sickness was indeed the same virus that Dr. Chua had identified in Colorado at the CDC research lab. But that knowledge didn't help Qian Bing's doctors. Shortly after he was admitted, Qian Bing fell into a vegetative state and then died. In early June of 1999, around 3 months after Qian Bing died, Dr. Chua was back at his office in Kuala Lumpur. It seemed like the mystery virus had been defeated, all thanks to Dr. Chua's quick thinking. But Dr. Chua wasn't sure if the mystery really was completely solved. The virus he had identified at the CDC's lab was called a paramyxovirus. This virus is transmitted from livestock animals to people, and many of the patients who had caught it worked with pigs. It wasn't affecting Muslims because they didn't eat pork. But many people in the country did eat pork, so Dr. Chua and a team of experts had advised the Malaysian authorities that if they wanted to stop the disease, they would have to make the difficult decision to kill as many pigs as possible in the affected areas. The government reacted quickly and sent squads of soldiers to eliminate over 1 million pigs. And after they did that, sure enough, cases of this mysterious disease started to dwindle. When it came to naming the virus, officials looked to the small pig farming town it had originated in and where Kiam Bing, the cabinet maker, was from, Nipah. They would call it the Nipah virus. But something kept bothering Dr. Chua. Most of the Nipah virus victims were farmers who had direct contact with infected pigs, which made sense. But nearly 20% of the patients had minimal or no contact with the animals, but they still got this disease. Kiam Bing, the cabinet maker, was one of those unlucky 20%. Dr. Chua knew that Kiam Bing must have caught this disease somewhere, and if it wasn't from pigs, then where did he get it from? Could it be that another animal was spreading the Nipah virus in addition to the pigs? Chua started to wonder if pigs really were the source of the virus or if they were just a carrier. Maybe, he thought, the true source of the virus was another creature altogether. And so now that the outbreak was under control following the elimination of all these pigs, the Malaysian government deployed a team of researchers to try to determine the true source of the Nipah virus. As the scientists investigated, they found that the Nipah virus was closely related to another virus that had caused a small outbreak in Australia a few years earlier. At the time, researchers had been able to identify the source of the outbreak. It was fruit bats. So now, Malaysian researchers quickly zeroed in on an extraordinary type of bat called the flying fox, which lived near the village of Nipah and throughout the country. These animals, among the largest bats in the world, can have wingspans of up to 5 feet, but they're not normally harmful to humans. They mostly mind their own business, feeding on fruit trees like durian, which was one of the primary crops grown in Nipah. But when researchers captured some flying foxes for study, they found that a large number of them tested positive for Nipah virus. The virus did not seem to harm the animals at all, but the researchers suddenly realized that the bats themselves were doing enormous harm to the people all around them. The bats, not the pigs and not the mosquitoes, were the real source of this terrible disease. Here's how it worked. The bats came out at night to feed on the durian flowers, and as they did that, their droppings and urine would fall to the ground below them. When morning came, the pigs were let out of their pens, and they came into contact with the bat droppings and the bat urine that was contaminated with the Nipah virus. And so did other animals, like horses and dogs, and in turn, these animals passed it on to their owners. That's how people who did not work with pigs became infected, and that's how Kiam Bing, the cabinet maker, got the virus. At some point, his dogs must have sniffed around some durian trees and come into contact with infected droppings, and then when Kiam Bing went to play with them and the dogs licked his face, they passed the virus on to him. In the past, there had never been a Nipah virus outbreak because fruit trees like durian and the bats were far from any industrial animal farms. But as farming expanded in Malaysia, fruit orchards were planted right next to pig farms and other commercial areas, which allowed the disease to spread. The discovery that fruit bats were the real spreader of the virus allowed the researchers to truly understand how the Nipah virus operated. But it also meant that future outbreaks would be impossible to stop. The fruit bats responsible for the Nipah virus live throughout Africa, Asia, and the Pacific Islands. There's no way to effectively control their population or to stop them from eating fruit from commercial farms. So the only way to truly stop the Nipah virus is to create a vaccine for it. But scientists haven't figured out how to make one yet. In recent years, there have been more outbreaks around the world, striking fear into scientists and public health officials. The World Health Organization has labeled this virus as being a virus with catastrophic global pandemic potential. If the virus ever becomes airborne, it could be transmitted through coughs, sneezes, or contaminated surfaces. If that happens, millions of lives will be at risk. and we might not be able to do anything about it.
Lindsay was a fresh college graduate, and she was at a crossroads in her life because even though she just earned her degree, she really didn't know what she wanted to do with her life. And because she was an experienced backpacker, she thought a good way to, kind of get her life together would be to go on a sort of retreat, go out into the woods, go out into nature, and kind of find herself. So she had planned this very detailed 43.3 mile hike along the Appalachian Trail, starting in South Carolina, where the first 7 days of the hike she would be totally on her own, and then at the 7-day mark she would meet up with a friend at a particular rendezvous point. Her friend would give her resupplies and would be her companion for the rest of the hike. When Eloise told her parents what her plans were, they were not concerned for her safety because she was an experienced backpacker. She had made trips like this before. And so they said, great, we'll see you when you get back. So on November 4th, Eloise sets out to begin her journey down the Appalachian Trail. And the first couple of days of her hike were great. The weather was beautiful, the scenery was amazing, and she had all this time to just kind of be by herself and look internal and think hard about what she wanted to do with her life. But on the third day, when she woke up, she was sleeping inside of a tent she had camped just off the trail. She woke up and she had this intense sense of dread. She couldn't really place where it was coming from, but she knew something was wrong, and she's kind of doing inventory of her life, like, what did I forget? Is there something that I'm just not thinking about right now? But she kind of pushes it aside mentally and thinks, okay, you know what? I'm just going to pack up my campsite here and get hiking, and I'm bound to, come up with what it is that's making me feel this way. So she gets out of her tent and she begins packing up her campsite, and she's looking out, kind of scanning the tree line, not because she was looking for anything, but just because she happened to be looking out. And she could have sworn that she saw a man standing, 30, 40 feet away behind a tree. And she kind of did a double take and was staring at him. It's broad daylight, it's the morning, and they're near a trail, so it isn't like unbelievable that there might be someone near her at that very moment. But she kind of did a double take and she looked at them again, and this person was gone. And she stood there for a minute just kind of looking in the direction of where she had seen this guy, wondering, is my mind playing tricks on me? Did I really see someone there? Why aren't they showing themselves again? If there was someone there, they clearly must have just been looking at me. Why aren't they, poking their heads out again to communicate with me in some way? We're out in the middle of nowhere. We should be talking to each other. But the guy never shows himself again. And so as she's standing there wondering what she should do, she isn't ready to yell out to this person because there's part of her that's a little bit nervous about yelling out to some stranger in the middle of the woods. But she starts to get this really intense feeling that she's being watched. And it feels an awful lot like the sense of dread she had while she was in the tent. And she's starting to wonder, are my instincts or is my sixth sense picking up that I'm being watched? Like there's some predator out there looking at me right now? And even though she has no way of knowing if that's actually true, she's alone in the middle of the woods, and even though she's experienced, she can't help but feel really vulnerable. And because this guy is just not showing himself again, she feels a little bit threatened. And so she begins to panic and she starts packing up all of her stuff as quickly as she can. And as soon as she can, she takes off down the trail away from that guy she saw in the woods. As she was walking down this trail, she couldn't help but think someone was right behind her. And she kept turning around to see if this person or whoever it was behind her, and no one was ever there. But this visceral feeling that she was being watched, that sense of dread she had, it just was not going away. And so she started walking faster and faster. Before long, she was running, and she's realizing that she's in a section of the Appalachian Trail that's very remote. She's not near civilization. She's not near her next rendezvous point. And so she's thinking to herself, I need to get off this trail. I need to get to a road. I need to get away from here as soon as I possibly can. And so her options were to continue on this trail for several miles, and it would probably take her until well into the night before she was going to reach civilization. Or she could take a shortcut because she believed there was a road that was running parallel to her trail, but it was way down the mountain. It would require leaving the trail and basically cutting through the wilderness to get down to this road. But she was pretty confident it was right down there. And because this threat of this person or thing following her was so intense for her, she decided to leave the trail. She couldn't stand the idea of having to spend another night out in the middle of the woods with this person stalking her. And so she walks off the trail and starts running down the mountain.
It wasn't long before she started to hear audible sounds coming from what she believed to be this person that was following her. And she would turn around and there'd be no one there. And then she started to walk, trying to listen as she's walking, and she would hear footsteps far away from her, and she'd turn and there'd be nobody there, but she was certain someone was following her, someone was stalking her. And the sounds that were coming out of this person, this animal, whatever it was, they sounded like, a deep male voice, but she couldn't recognize if it was a language of some kind. It just sounded more like a grunt or a yell of some kind. And so her heart rate's elevated, she's panicking, and she's walking as fast as she can just through the middle of the wilderness, hoping she's walking towards this road. But after walking and running for miles into the middle of nowhere, she has not come to a road. It's now completely dark out, and she knows she's lost. And so she has to set up camp in the middle of nowhere, and she knows somewhere out in the middle of the woods is some person or something that is stalking me. And she's all alone. She has no way to contact anyone. She doesn't have a cell phone. It's 1989. And so she sets up her campsite and she gets in her tent, she zips it up, and she lays there hoping she doesn't hear any sounds. And sure enough, within minutes of being inside of that tent, she starts hearing those audible sounds coming from somewhere in the forest. And she hears what sounds like heavy footsteps walking around the perimeter of her campsite. All night long, she hears this. But luckily, they don't come up right to her tent. So there's some separation between her and whatever is making these sounds. And then finally, the sun comes up, she is out of that tent, packs it up, and continues running in the direction she hopes is the road. And of course, all day long, she has that sense that someone is watching her. She's hearing footsteps coming from behind her. She would turn, she doesn't see anything. She would hear that audible grunting sound, that low voice coming from somewhere behind her. But again, she would never see whoever it was or whatever it was that was making the sound. And then again, the sun is starting to set and she has not found the road. She hasn't found a trail. And she's thinking to herself, I can't even backtrack, because if I turn around and start walking backwards, I'm bound to run into this very thing I'm trying to escape. And so once again, she sets up her campsite in the middle of nowhere. She gets inside, and as soon as she's laying in her tent, she starts hearing those heavy footsteps somewhere out in the woods, kind of walking around the perimeter of her campsite. She's hearing that low audible sound that she can't quite place. And at some point she falls asleep. She gets up the next morning, she jumps out of her tent, packs it up, and starts running, hopefully in the direction that will bring her to civilization. A couple days later, when Eloise was supposed to meet her friend on the trail at the 7-day mark, and they were gonna finish the hike together, well, Eloise doesn't show up. But after several hours, when Eloise did not show up, her friend left the trail and contacted authorities and filed a missing person report. And the police would launch this massive search for Eloise along the stretch of the Appalachian Trail where she had said she would be. And for the next 14 days, hundreds of police and volunteers and helicopters are scouring this area, and there's no sign of Eloise. And so after 14 days from the time her friend filed the missing person report, the police had to turn the search off, and they say, look, we can't find her. 2 days after the search was terminated, so 23 days after Eloise had initially set off for her trek through the Appalachian Trail, a hunter that was out in the middle of nowhere near the Appalachian Trail discovers Eloise perched up against a tree. She's totally emaciated, she's dehydrated, she's delirious, but she's alive. At first, she was terrified of the hunter because she believed the hunter was this person that had been following her. But when she realized he was there to help, she went with him. She was brought back and brought to a hospital, and she was checked out. And besides being dehydrated and, emaciated, she was okay. And she would detail in multiple interviews and in her official statement that she had been chased for the past almost 3 weeks in the middle of the woods, and she doesn't know who it was or why they were chasing her. And then interestingly, she said right before she was found, so a couple of days before this hunter finds her, this person, this thing, whatever it was that was following her, got so close to her a couple different times that she was so scared she ditched her backpack that contained all of her life-saving equipment, like her sleeping bag and her tent, and it had some food and water in there. She ditched that so she could be lighter, so she could run faster away from this thing that is chasing her in the woods. So you gotta figure, you gotta be at such a high level of fear that you're prepared to ditch the one thing you really require to survive out in the wilderness, which was her pack full of supplies. And then after she's ditched her pack and she's run for some distance, she's got no supplies, no food, no water, she stumbles across this tree in the middle of nowhere that wedged inside the trunk is a cache of donuts and pound cake. And so she takes the donuts and pound cake, and between that and the stream water she had found, that's what kept her alive for the last few days before she was found. Eloise says she has no idea what to make of her experience, and law enforcement were baffled by it as well. Some people think Eloise had a mental break, and she effectively made this whole situation up, that she really was lost in the woods, but no one was chasing her, and she was just kind of paranoid and running around the wilderness for a couple of weeks. Other people, including park rangers that work that stretch of the Appalachian Trail, believe it's possible she could have been stalked by wild men, which are basically people that live out in the mountains that are effectively feral, that live off the land, and they've been known, according to local legend, they've been known to attack park rangers, and people that live out in that area have claimed to have seen these wild men, and they kind of match the description of what she was describing. But as of right now, there's no official explanation for what happened to her other than she got lost and was found again. On June 7th, 1951, two families from Santa Fe, New Mexico met up at the Santa Fe ski basin to have a picnic together and to enjoy the mountain air. During the summer months when there's no snow on the ground, the Santa Fe ski basin is a very popular location for hikers because the terrain is very rugged, and if you get up to the top of the basin, there's these incredible views overlooking the valley. But on this day, the two families decided they wanted to have a picnic at the base of the basin, basically looking up the mountain. As the parents were setting up the picnic site, the kids started playing together, and that was Larry and Janet McGee, who were brother and sister aged 7 and 5 respectively, and Stephen Cross, who was 3 years old. After they finished setting up their picnic site, they look around and realize the kids are gone, and they're thinking, we just saw them like 2 minutes ago, so they can't have gone very far. And so they start looking around for their kids, and they can't find them. They're yelling out for them, and they're starting to get a little bit more worried, and they start branching out farther and farther, and they realize the only other place they could have gone is up into the woods, which are very steep and very rugged. So they're thinking, well, they can't have gone into the mountains. That would be impossible for these young kids to get very far, and they aren't responding to our calls. It's possible they could have been abducted. And so one of the parents ran down to the main building of the actual ski resort where they kept a staff member in there during the summer months, and they were able to get inside and use a phone, and they called authorities. So the police come out and they set up these huge spotlights that are aimed up at the mountain. And so the idea was, if the kids did get up into the mountain somehow, they would see these lights and hopefully walk down to them. After they set up the spotlights, the police began combing the side of the mountain in hopes that the kids were not abducted. But despite the spotlights and hundreds of searchers and people yelling out for these kids, they never heard back from the kids. They didn't find them. And so all night they're looking for them, and they're realizing that there's a pretty good chance they're probably not here, and that means they probably were abducted. And so by the following afternoon, things were really starting to look grim. There was no sign of these kids anywhere. And that's when a searcher who was way outside of the primary search area, they were about 3.5 miles away, thousands of feet up in elevation. They're up there and they're looking around and they're getting ready to leave when they see something out of the corner of their eye that looks like a person. They turn around and one of the kids is poking their head up from behind a log. And the searchers run over to them, and sure enough, the 3 kids were actually inside of this downed log, and they were all okay. As the searchers are picking them up and calling this in, they're thinking to themselves, how in the world did these kids get so far away? Once the children were brought back down to the search headquarters and were reunited with their parents and were checked out by a doctor who said, yep, they're a little dehydrated, but they're okay. After all that was done, the police asked them the question that everybody was thinking, how did you get where you were found? And Larry, the oldest of the group, he was 7 years old. It took him a minute, but eventually he said, they were playing around the picnic area and they went just barely into the tree line when all of a sudden a bear came out from behind a tree and began chasing them. And the 3 of them ran 3.5 miles up a mountain to find this log, which they jumped inside of, and they hid inside of this log from this bear, which apparently was patrolling the area looking for them. And in addition to this bear that was apparently walking around the area looking for them, Larry said they were especially scared of the gorilla that was walking around the area looking for them as well. Now, it's easy to discount Larry and the kid's story because you could say, okay, well, the gorilla they saw was actually just a searcher looking for them.
Except there was no one in that area looking for the kids near that log until right before they were found. It was kind of like a last-ditch effort to push outside the boundaries of the main search area. It was just kind of a miracle they actually located them. And Larry and the kids were saying this gorilla and this bear were looking for them on the first day and first night they were out there. So there were no searchers out there at that time. As for the bear, there have been bear sightings in the Santa Fe ski basin, although it is fairly rare. But if it was a bear that was chasing these kids, it would have caught them. A bear is not gonna not be able to catch 3 small children running uphill. So either there wasn't a bear, or it was some other animal that might have resembled a bear. But what type of an animal would chase 3 small children who are very vulnerable 3.5 miles up a mountain only to abandon them? But even if we say, you know what, there's no way the bear and the gorilla had anything to do with this, this is just kids who got lost and they wound up in the woods and they were found, and that's it. Fine. But I have a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old, and I can tell you right now, there's no way they could cover a 3.5 mile distance uphill in really rugged mountainous terrain in a 24-hour cycle. There's no way. Without help, that's not possible. I would say the only caveat to that would be if my children were fearful for their lives, in which case adrenaline would kick in, and they probably could cover that distance in a 24-hour period. That certainly lends credibility to the idea that Larry, Janet, and Steve were in fact running for their lives, and they had that adrenaline kick, and that's how they were able to cover that distance. But were they really running from a bear or a gorilla? We don't know, and there's been no further investigation into this case, and I think that's because the kids were found alive. The parents, the police, they're happy, and everybody moved on.
De wind fluistert zacht door de velden heen. De wolken dansen in de blauwe lucht. Het woud roept ons met zijn mysterie. De zonsondergang kleurt de horizon. Oh, natuur, jouw plaats zo puur. In elke bloem, in elke boom. Oh, natuur, jouw hart zo groot. Jij bent de ziel van ons bestaan.
From 2002 to 2006, Cullen Finnerty was perhaps the most successful college quarterback in history, winning 3 national championships and being named the Division II Player of the Decade. He was also perhaps the toughest college quarterback in history. Most quarterbacks will spend their careers looking to avoid getting smashed by defenders. Not Cullen. Cullen was 6'2", 240 pounds, and he would tell his teammates that he wanted to get hit, and he would hit back. And his coaches hated it about him, but his teammates loved this about him. Cullen was also famous for playing through injuries. His junior year in college, he broke his collarbone, and he didn't tell anyone, and he played through an entire playoff series that he won. After college, Cullen's professional football career was not nearly as successful as his amateur one. He played briefly for 2 NFL football teams, the Baltimore Ravens and the Denver Broncos, but when he wasn't getting any playing time and he just could see the writing on the wall that this was not going to be a match, he was not going to make it in the NFL, he left for Europe to play in a European football league. But when his European football career started to sputter out as well around 2009, he came back to the United States where he joined a very small-time indoor arena football league. And while Cullen's love of football was still there as much as it ever was, he knew at this point, playing at this low of a level, that his career was effectively over. Around the same time that Cullen was hanging up his football cleats, he would meet Jennifer, who would become his wife. She was an all-state volleyball player and in many ways was just as competitive and as athletic as Cullen was. They were kind of like a perfect match for each other. They married in 2010, and Cullen, this big man, big-time quarterback, was shaking and crying at the altar because he was so nervous and excited about marrying Jennifer. Because I think this was a really big turning point for him, where he was basically putting football in the past and starting this new life and building a family with Jennifer, and he was really excited about it. The newlywed couple moved into a house together in Michigan where they had 2 kids, and Cullen landed a good job in medical sales, and by all accounts, Cullen was just hitting his stride post-football. On Memorial Day weekend in 2013, Jennifer's family was planning this 3-day fishing trip along the Baldwin River in Michigan, and the Finnertys decided they would join them. And so Cullen and his wife and kids, they rented a cabin that was going to be near the campsite that Jennifer's family was staying at. And for the entire weekend, it was just this great fishing trip where everybody had a great time and the weather was beautiful. And on May 26th, so the last night of this 3-day fishing trip, Cullen, who had recently purchased this pontoon boat that they had used for this fishing trip, he wanted to just go out one more time on his boat, this boat that he was really proud of, and fish for another 30-45 minutes before ending the weekend. So Cullen put on his waders and his jacket, he grabbed his fishing pole, and he had his family drive him to the stairs that led down to the water where his pontoon boat was. Before he walked down the steps, he turned and told his family that he'd be out for about 30 to 45 minutes and that he wanted to be picked up at the next boat ramp down the way and that he would call when he needed a ride. 42 minutes later at 9:27 p.m., Jennifer receives a phone call from her husband, and she's expecting it to be the call where he says, "Okay, I'm ready to get picked up." But when she answers the phone, Cullen is frantic, and he's telling her that he's being followed by 2 men in the tree line, that he's out on the water on his pontoon, but there are 2 men in the tree line that he can't see, but he can hear them, and they've been following him for some time. And before Jennifer can even get a word out, Cullen says to her that he's going to beach the boat and take his clothes off, and then he hangs up. Jennifer immediately tries calling Cullen back repeatedly, but he's not picking up, and so she's left feeling totally confused about what her husband has just told her. But what stood out to her was how scared he sounded on the phone. And fear was not something she typically associated with Cullen. This beast of a man, this tough football player, he didn't get scared. So for him to be that scared sounding and to be describing people basically stalking him, she knew he was in serious trouble. So she calls 911 and she describes where he is in the Baldwin River, and the police take her report and say, "We'll send someone out right away." After Jennifer got off the phone with police, she called her family and told them about this really strange phone call from Cullen and how she had just called the police and she didn't know what to do. And so her brother tried calling Cullen and Cullen answered. And when he did, Matt said, "Hey Cullen, where are you?" And Cullen would say, "I don't know where I am, but there's these 2 guys that are still following me." And Matt would say, "Are you still on your boat? Are you on land?" And all Cullen said is, "It's getting pretty rough out here." And then he hung up. Afterwards, Matt would call Jen and he would tell her about this phone call with Cullen, and it really didn't add any clarity to the situation. And so Jen and her family decide the best thing they can do is go to the boat ramp where Cullen had said he wanted to be picked up in hopes that maybe he would make his way there and they would find him. So Jennifer and her family head out to this location and Cullen's not there. They get out, they're yelling for him. There's no sign of him, and shortly after, a police car would show up because this was one of the areas where Jennifer had said when she spoke to police that Cullen might be. And so the police officer gets out, they take an official statement from Jennifer, and at this point they file an official missing person report. Before the police began looking for Cullen, they reached out to his wireless service provider and they asked them to ping his cell phone from the tower. Any service provider has the ability to roughly triangulate the location of a cell phone based on the last few locations of the phone. The last 4 locations that the service provider pinged for Cullen were up to 4 miles apart from each other, which was bizarre in its own way, because the idea that in a very rugged, rough area in a very short amount of time that Cullen had been moving 4, 5, 6, 7 miles just to get to these different points, that didn't really make sense. But also when they looked at these points on a map, it looked like each of them was either near a paved road, or in order to get to them, you would have had to cross a paved road. And so they're thinking to themselves, why does he keep moving point to point if at any one of these locations he's near relative safety? But as strange as these 4 locations were, the police now had a really solid starting point. So they dispatched people to each of these points and they began combing along the river where he had last been seen. And within an hour, they discovered his boat. It was a little ways down from where he had been dropped off. It was missing an oar and it was basically beached on the side of the river. It wasn't clear if it had been intentionally beached, but Cullen wasn't in it, and when they searched around the area, they couldn't find any sign that Cullen was in the area. They were yelling for him, he wasn't yelling back. Interestingly, a man who owned property near where the pontoon boat was found reported to police hearing screaming or yelling coming from the area where the boat was found around the same time that Cullen went missing. But despite this piece of information, it didn't actually help them discover where Cullen actually went. For the next 48 hours, police and hundreds of people searched in the areas where his cell phone had pinged and along the river where his pontoon had been found, but there was no sign of him. Then, on the evening of May 28th, approximately 48 hours after Cullen had gone missing, they discovered his body. It was located less than a half mile away from a paved road, and it was situated in between those 4 points that the cell phone provider had given. He was laying completely face down with his right arm under his body and his left arm over his head, clutching some grass. When they rolled him over, he had some blood coming out of his nose, but besides that, there was no significant trauma anywhere on his body. Cullen appeared to be wearing all of his clothes. However, it was noted that the strap on his waders was really badly twisted. Now, if he had never taken his clothes off, that would have been something he would have fixed. It would have been very uncomfortable when he started this trip to go fishing. That would have been something he would have fixed. Now, he said to his wife on the phone that he was going to be taking his clothes off, which there was no explanation for that, but he clearly said that to his wife, and she reported that to police. And so some have speculated that between that phone call and finding him with the twisted strap on his waders, that indicates that perhaps his clothes did come off at some point over the past couple of days and were put back